for you.
What is it?
It's called Hey Good Looking.
Oh.
Hank Williams was 29 years old when he died. 40 years around Nashville trying to write a song as great as him.
Until he came on. And I mean, it was like sit there through everybody and waiting just to hear that voice.
Was going to happen in music and the influence that was going to be felt in music, the music that was coming.
He was not just a singer. He was a storm that ripped through country music and left scars no one could ignore. By the time Hank Williams Sr. was 29, he had conquered the charts, shocked the establishment, and burned himself out in a way that still haunts music history. His voice carried the pain of a lifetime, his songs sounded like confessions, and his end was so sudden, so mysterious, that fans still argue about what really happened on that final night. Some say it was fate, others say it was the demons he could never outrun. But the truth about Hank Williams is not just about how he lived, it is about how fast he fell, and the secrets he left behind. Hank Williams was born Hiram Williams in a small Alabama town in 1923. And from the very start, life did not deal him an easy hand. His father, a World War I veteran, suffered from severe health problems and was mostly absent, leaving Hank to grow up in poverty with a mother who worked tirelessly just to keep the family afloat. But the most defining part of his childhood was not just hardship, it was pain. Hank was born with spina bifida occulta, a spinal condition that left him in constant discomfort, even as a boy. Doctors at the time did not have solutions, and the pain never went away. That hidden struggle became the shadow that followed him through his entire life, and some say it is what gave his songs that aching edge no one else could replicate. While other kids played without worry, Hank often felt like an outsider, carrying a weight that forced him to find comfort in music before he even understood what fame was. That music came from an unlikely teacher, Rufus T-Tot Payne, a black street musician who played blues around the community. Payne became Hank's mentor, showing him chords, rhythm, and the raw soul of storytelling through song. In an era when segregation was the law of the land, Hank learning from Payne was remarkable, and it shaped his sound forever. Hank blended the country twang of his southern roots with the blues grit he picked up from T-Tot, creating a style that felt authentic, broken, and powerful all at once. By his teens, Hank was performing at local radio stations, busking on sidewalks, and building a small but loyal following. People were drawn to his voice, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Every note carried sorrow, longing, and truth, even when he was barely old enough to drive. By the late 1930s, Hank was fronting his own band, the Drifting Cowboys, and earning more than most adults in town. He had charisma, a restless energy, and a way of holding a crowd that made people believe they were watching something rare. But behind that success was already a troubling pattern. Drinking. Locals noticed Hank could outdrink just about anyone, and it did not take long for alcohol to go from a pastime to a crutch. Even in his teenage years, he was relying on the bottle to dull the chronic pain in his back and the emotional burden he carried. That dependence would become a dangerous thread woven into the rest of his story. Still, audiences could not get enough. His early radio broadcasts made him a household name across Alabama, and by the early 1940s, he was pushing his way onto bigger stages. Yet, even as his career began to climb, the people closest to him saw the warning signs. His temper, his unpredictable behavior, and his reliance on alcohol made him difficult to handle, but those flaws seemed invisible once he stepped up to a microphone. When he sang, it felt like the whole room stopped to listen. Hank had tapped into something that few artists ever find, a sound that was not just music but confession. And once the industry realized what he had, the climb to stardom became unstoppable. But success would not bring peace. In fact, it only gave Hank more pressure, more expectations, and more reason to run from the pain that never left his body or his heart. By the early 1940s, Hank Williams was not just a local talent. He was a rising force whose voice carried across the South. The Drifting Cowboys, his band of young musicians, became his ticket out of the small-town grind. They played dances, fairs, and roadhouses, and no matter where they set up, Hank had a way of making people feel like he was singing directly to them. His songs were not polished in the way Nashville liked, but that rawness became his weapon. While other performers tried to look and sound perfect, Hank leaned into the cracks in his voice, letting them bleed emotion. It made him stand out in a scene crowded with hopefuls. But for all his natural talent, there was always a conflict brewing. Hank lived for the stage, but he was also living with a pain and dependency that made him unpredictable. Radio gave him the break he needed. Small stations began airing his performances, and soon the name Hank Williams and his Drifting Cowboys was known far beyond Alabama. Fans wrote in asking to hear more. Promoters booked him because they knew crowds would show up. Even when his voice cracked or he stumbled through a set, people left talking about him. His songs spoke to heartbreak, longing, and loss in a way no one else could capture. Country music was still carving its identity, but Hank gave it something unmistakable, the sound of raw humanity. And yet behind the applause, he was already building a reputation for unreliability. Sometimes he would not show up at all. Sometimes he showed up too drunk to stand. At first, fans forgave him. After all, genius was often messy. But the pattern was becoming hard to ignore. By 1946, Hank had caught the attention of music publishers in Nashville, the city that would define his future. His first recordings did not shake the industry, but they showed promise. Then came the breakthrough, Move It On Over in 1947, a song that blended humor with frustration, sung with a rhythm that bordered on rock and roll before rock even had a name. It climbed the charts, giving Hank his first real taste of national fame. The industry suddenly saw him not as a local novelty, but as a star in the making. Nashville opened its doors, but not without conditions. Executives loved his talent, but worried about his drinking and erratic behavior. He was given chances most newcomers never got, but every chance came with warnings. Don't mess this up. In 1949, Hank made the leap that would change everything, the Grand Ole Opry. Standing on that stage was the ultimate validation for a country artist. And Hank did not just perform, he exploded. His rendition of Lovesick Blues that night sent the audience into a frenzy, and he had to be called back for 6 encores. No one had seen anything like it. Overnight, he went from rising hopeful to certified star. The Grand Ole Opry crowd adored him. And suddenly, Hank Williams was not just a Southern favorite, he was America's country music sensation. But with fame came expectation, and with expectation came pressure. The more successful he became, the more he leaned on alcohol and painkillers to keep going. The same flaws that haunted his teenage years were now magnified on the biggest stage of his life. To the audience, he was untouchable, a golden boy who could do no wrong. To those around him, he was a storm they could not control. The spotlight had finally found Hank Williams, but it only made his shadow darker. By the early 1950s, Hank Williams was everywhere. His songs were not just topping country charts, they were crossing into mainstream America, blasting from jukeboxes, radios, and living rooms across the nation. Hits like I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, Cold Cold Heart, and Your Cheatin' Heart were not just popular tunes, they became cultural touchstones that defined heartbreak for an entire generation. What made them so powerful was not just their melodies, but the honesty dripping from every word. Hank did not sound like a man singing to entertain. He sounded like a man bleeding out his soul in real time. For fans, it was irresistible. For Hank, it was exhausting. Every performance was a confession, and behind that confession was a body and mind breaking under the weight of it all. His health was collapsing. The spinal defect he had carried since birth grew worse with age, leaving him in constant, crippling pain. Doctors tried to treat him with injections and painkillers, but in the 1950s, medicine was crude, and solutions were temporary at best. Alcohol became his other doctor, and the two together created a dangerous mix. What started as a way to dull pain became an addiction that drove his every move. Promoters began to notice the cracks. He would miss shows, cancel appearances, or stumble on stage too drunk to remember lyrics. The very songs that had made him a household name were now reminding people of the man they were losing before their eyes. The industry tried to shield him, but Nashville was ruthless. The Grand Ole Opry, once his crowning glory, eventually had no choice but to ban him in 1952 after too many missed and botched performances. It was an unthinkable fall from grace. The man who had electrified the Opry stage with 6 encores just a few years earlier was now considered unreliable, a liability too big to keep around. For Hank, it was humiliating. He had reached the peak of his career only to find himself shut out by the very institution that made him a legend. Still, his popularity with fans did not fade. If anything, the chaos surrounding his personal life made him even more fascinating. Rumors swirled about his drinking binges, violent outbursts, and womanizing, and the tabloids could not get enough. The public saw a man destroying himself, and yet they kept buying every record he released. Songs like Kauliga and Your Cheatin' Heart, recorded near the end of his life, cemented his status as one of the greatest songwriters in American history. But the irony was cruel. The more his music immortalized heartbreak, the more his life became the very tragedy he was singing about. Friends, family, and bandmates tried to intervene, but Hank was a man who lived on extremes. When he was sober, he was charming, witty, and magnetic. When he was drinking, he was reckless, angry, and impossible to control. He knew his demons were dragging him down, but he also knew they were fueling the very songs that made him famous. That paradox defined Hank Williams. He could not write without the pain, but the pain was killing him. And by the end of 1952, it was clear that something had to give. But instead of slowing down, Hank pushed harder, into more touring, more drinking, and more chaos. And what happened next would mark one of the darkest chapters in country music history. Hank Williams's love life was as turbulent as his career, and it became another battlefield where his demons played out in public. At the center of it all was Audrey Shepherd, the woman who would become his first wife and his most complicated partner. They married in 1944, and almost instantly, their relationship was a storm. Audrey was not just his wife, she was also his duet partner, pushing her way onto stage and recordings despite having little of Hank's natural talent. Their marriage was marked by constant fights, affairs on both sides, and explosive arguments that spilled out of the home and into Hank's career. Yet for all the bitterness, Hank kept returning to her, and their connection became one of the most dramatic love-hate sagas in country music. But it was not just Audrey. Hank had an eye for women, and fame only fueled his appetite. Groupies, flings, and rumored affairs followed him on the road, and his drinking only made his behavior more unpredictable. By the early 1950s, his marriage to Audrey finally collapsed under the weight of betrayal and abuse, ending in divorce in 1952. For Hank, it was another devastating blow, one that pushed him deeper into self-destruction. But instead of retreating, he rushed headfirst into another marriage, one that only made his story more scandalous. Enter Billie Jean Jones, a young woman with her own ambitions, who became Hank's second wife. Their marriage was chaotic from the start, with reports suggesting that Hank may not have been legally divorced from Audrey at the time. Even more shocking, within days of their wedding, Billie Jean had already sold tickets to their public marriage ceremonies, turning what should have been a personal affair into a circus spectacle. Nashville insiders were horrified, but fans could not look away. For some, it was proof that Hank's life had become nothing more than a show. Every heartbreak and scandal turned into entertainment. The chaos did not end there. After Hank's death, an even more shocking revelation came to light. A woman named Bobby Jett, who had been romantically involved with Hank briefly, gave birth to a daughter 5 days after his passing. That daughter, Jett Williams, would spend decades fighting for recognition as Hank's child. Legal battles over his estate dragged on for years, with lawsuits, contested wills, and bitter disputes between family members. It was as if Hank's personal turmoil had outlived him, leaving behind not just a legacy of music, but a tangled web of broken relationships and courtroom drama. All of this made Hank's personal life as famous as his music. Fans whispered about his affairs, gossiped over his marriages, and devoured every scandal that came out of Nashville. To some, he was a tragic romantic figure, a man too wild to be tied down. To others, he was reckless and selfish, leaving behind a trail of destruction for those who loved him. But either way, the drama around his relationships added to his legend. Hank Williams was not just a singer. He was a man whose private life played out like one of his songs, messy, painful, and unforgettable. And just as his personal battles seemed to hit their breaking point, his health and addictions were dragging him toward an ending that no one saw coming, but that everyone now remembers. By the end of 1952, Hank Williams was running on fumes. His career had slipped into chaos, his marriages had imploded, and his addictions were swallowing him whole. Yet the demand for his music never slowed. Promoters still booked him, fans still bought tickets, and Hank himself seemed determined to keep moving, even as his body gave out. That determination or desperation set the stage for one of the most infamous endings in music history. It was New Year's Eve, 1952, when Hank was scheduled to perform in Canton, Ohio. The weather was brutal, with ice and snow covering the roads. Hank's health was at its lowest point. He had recently undergone spinal procedures that left him in worse condition than before, and he was consuming a dangerous mix of alcohol and painkillers just to function. Too weak to drive himself, he hired a young college student named Charles Carr to chauffeur him from Montgomery, Alabama, up through the Appalachian Mountains. What should have been just another trip became Hank's final ride. On the journey, Hank was seen slumped in the back seat, his body frail and his speech slurred. At one stop in Knoxville, Tennessee, he was carried to his hotel room, too weak to walk on his own. A local doctor injected him with morphine and vitamin B12 before sending him back on the road. Whether that injection helped him or hastened his end remains debated to this day. By the time Carr pulled into a filling station in Oak Hill, West Virginia, on New Year's Day 1953, Hank was gone. He was only 29 years old. The details of his death became instant legend. In the back seat of that powder blue Cadillac, Hank Williams had died alone, his final hours spent in silence as the world prepared to celebrate a new year. When the news broke, fans were stunned. Country music's brightest star, the man who had redefined the genre, was gone before he reached 30. And just like his songs, the truth of his final moments was shrouded in heartbreak and unanswered questions. Was it the morphine, the alcohol, his lifelong spinal condition? Or was it simply the weight of years of pain finally catching up to him? No one could say for certain, and the mystery only deepened his myth. Even in death, Hank's story carried eerie details that fed speculation. Some claimed he had been writing lyrics in his final hours, with scraps of unfinished songs found among his belongings. Others insisted that he had predicted his own end, often saying he did not expect to live long. Whether those stories were true or just part of the legend, they made his death feel almost scripted, like one of his ballads coming to life in the cruelest way possible. What was undeniable was the impact. His funeral drew more than 20,000 people, an unprecedented crowd that stretched the streets of Montgomery. Fellow musicians, fans, and friends gathered to mourn the man who had burned so brightly and left so suddenly. In that moment, Hank Williams was not just remembered as a star. He was enshrined as a martyr of country music, a symbol of brilliance destroyed too soon. But his story did not end with the funeral. In many ways, it was only the beginning of the legend, because what followed his death would be just as messy, dramatic, and fascinating as his short, explosive life. Hank Williams's death did not silence him. It turned him into something larger than life. In the years that followed, his reputation grew into myth. Fans did not just mourn the man, they clung to the belief that his songs carried pieces of his soul, and in many ways they were right. Record labels scrambled to release the backlog of recordings he had left behind, and posthumous hits like Your Cheatin' Heart and Ka Liga stormed the charts. It was as if Hank had reached from beyond the grave to remind the world that heartbreak does not die with the singer. Each new release deepened the sense that Hank was not just a musician. He was a prophet of sorrow whose words were eternal. But what really fueled his legend were the stories. Rumors spread about unfinished lyrics and notebooks filled with songs he never got the chance to record. Whispers circulated among musicians and insiders about scraps of paper with lines of poetry, stashed away in briefcases or tucked into coat pockets. Over time, those fragments took on a mystical quality. They were not just words on paper, they were the missing pieces of a man who had become almost mythological. In 2011, long after his death, some of these lost notebooks were finally brought to life when artists like Bob Dylan and Norah Jones recorded his unfinished lyrics, proving that even decades later, Hank still had something new to say. His influence also stretched far beyond country music. Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Bob Dylan all cited Hank Williams as a direct inspiration. To Elvis, he was proof that raw emotion could captivate millions. To Dylan, he was a poet who understood the human condition better than anyone. Hank's simplicity, 3 chords, and the truth became a philosophy that echoed through rock, folk, and country alike. Every genre that dealt with heartbreak and rebellion owed something to him. Yet for all the praise, there was also a darker side to his posthumous reputation. Biographers and critics painted him as self-destructive, bitter, and at times cruel. Some who knew him personally described him as envious of other artists, quick to anger, and nearly impossible to work with. That duality, beloved by millions but difficult behind closed doors, only added to the fascination. Was Hank a tragic genius destroyed by his pain, or a reckless man who could not handle success? The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Hank Williams's story is more than the tale of a country singer who rose too fast and died too young. It is a mirror of what happens when raw talent collides with unbearable pain. He came from almost nothing, turned his suffering into art, and in less than a decade, carved his name into the heart of American music. Yet for all the triumphs, his life remains one of the most tragic cautionary tales in entertainment history. His songs spoke to millions, but they also spoke for himself, a man crying out through music because he could not find peace in life. That paradox is what makes him unforgettable. He was both the healer and the one who needed healing most. Today, when you hear "I'm so lonesome I could cry" or "Your Cheatin' Heart," it is impossible not to feel the weight of a man pouring everything he had into a few minutes of sound. That is why his music has lasted. It was not built on fame, image, or polish. It was built on truth, even when that truth was ugly. Hank did not hide his demons. He sang them, and in doing so, he gave the world songs that remain just as powerful now as they were when first recorded. Generations who never saw him alive still know his words, still feel his pain, and still recognize that voice as something rare. And so the legend lives on. Every time a young musician strums a guitar and sings about heartbreak, they are following in his footsteps. Every time a crowd leans in to listen to lyrics that cut too close to home, they are experiencing the same magic that Hank unleashed on stage decades ago. Hank Williams Sr. died in the back of a car on a cold New Year's Day, but in a way, he never left. His ghost lingers in every melody about love and loss, every lyric that sounds like a confession, every voice that trembles with pain. The man is gone, but the myth remains. Because in the end, Hank Williams did not just sing country music, he became the very definition of it. Honest, messy, heartbreaking, and real. And as long as people fall in love and fall apart, Hank's voice will never stop echoing through time.